We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome. This week's Torah portion is Korach. So let's start off with who is Korach and what is the sin? Because the punishment is pretty dramatic. So there's clearly a terrible sin that's committed. So who is Korach and what's the sin? Go ahead, Brad.
Korach is Moshe's first cousin, and the sin was I see it as the continuation of the rabble rousers against Moshe in the parsha before.
Good. So, okay, a couple things here Ron is bringing. One is that they're cousins. Did everybody know that they're first cousins?
No.
So that's very important. If you open up, let's actually find where it is in the Etzchaim.
You want me to know where? You want me to quote chapter and verse?
Jews should get more into that. Christians are very good at that. Yeah. Looking for it now.
It's 16.
16. I have, yes, chapter 16 of the Midbar of Numbers. 860. Thank you so much. Perfect. Page 860. But if you look, first we start with the lineage. That's the very first thing we get in the parsha, right? Now Korach, son of Ishar, son of Kohat, son of Levi. Okay, first that's your first hint, right? Son of Levi, that they're, Moses and Aaron are the Levites. Aaron starts the Kohanim, right? He's the first high priest, but he's from the tribe of Levi, right? So here we have the first connection. And if you do the family tree, you'll see that they're actually first cousins. So if that's the case, and by the way, Ron, so now we get into what is the sin, right? Because if they're first cousins, and here are your cousins, Aaron and Moses, and you feel like you're on the outs, right? And he actually brings a very compelling argument. What's his argument that he brings to Moses?
All the community is holy.
Kadoshi, we are all holy, right? So that's
Okay, I have something to say about that.
okay. Well, hold on one second.
So might the rabbi.
We are all holy is a compelling argument, right? Who are you to elevate yourself over us? First of all, the subtext here is what makes you any different, right? We're cousins, right? And you are the royalty. Meanwhile, we feel slighted, although that's not necessarily true. As Levites, they do have first of all, remember they replaced the firstborns as God's chosen, right? That just happened where God, first it was the firstborn belonged to God, now it's the Levites, and the Levites are set apart for the sacred duty of basically being the custodians of the Mishkan, right? They hold the sacred ritual objects. That is the second highest honor, right? Apart from being the high priest. But it seems he's not satisfied. He and his company is not satisfied with that second highest honor you could have in the community and their leadership service role. And he's going for the top. But again, there's a case there's both the biological claim, the fact that they're so close as family, but then the second being we're all holy. So if we're really, it's sort of like, you might even put democracy in his mouth, saying, and again, Yitro tried to do that too, his father-in-law, remember when he tells Moses to delegate. So here might just be another example of someone saying, hey, you're taking too much on to yourself, right? You should delegate, you should share the wealth. So what is inherently so bad about this? Why is this ultimately a catastrophic sin? Ron had a
say about the whole nation is holy.
Yeah.
If you go back, I think it's Exodus 19:6 or something like that.
Now you're quoting chapter.
Now I'm telling you because I just heard it really weak. It doesn't say.
Welcome,
It doesn't say the whole nation is holy. It says the whole nation will be holy. And then there's all the ifs.
Yeah.
Well, the ifs haven't been fulfilled yet.
Okay, I love that. So we have this Shabbos, Ben and Rachel, a wonderful young couple. It happens to be the Ufraf Parsha for Rabbi Alex and myself too. And they grew up at Park, so don't take any offense to this, but this was obviously before we were rabbis here and before we fell in love with this community, we had our Ufraf at Park, which is where she grew up. And Rabbi Rosie gave us the charge. And she gave us a message that still sticks with me because I thought, and it's exactly along those lines of what you just said. She was saying, first of all, they say we're all Kadoshim. And Kedushin, the same word for the traditional Jewish wedding, Kedushin, Kodesh, sanctified, is the word that they use to describe themselves. We're all holy. But the difference is Korach is making the claim that we have inherently arrived already at holiness, right? Just by virtue of being the Jewish people, we are holy. We've arrived. But what Ron is saying is that actually, if you look at what God says you will be, and it's conditional if you follow my laws, if you did, if. So what the metaphor she was making for our sake as a newly, going to be married couple was, don't look at marriage as the sanctity of having arrived. Your wedding is not the destination, right? It's the beginning of the journey of constantly work out the ifs that follow to attain that state of and retain that state of kiddushin. That marriage is something that you continuously work at and strive for to live in that space of sanctity. Oh, it's tough. It's hard. No, it's great. Thank God. Thank God. Okay, so that's the question of, is it a birthright, right? On two levels, I'm your cousin, and second, we're all holy by virtue of being Jews, or is it something that needs to be worked at? And Korach wasn't necessarily willing to put in the work. He just demanded what he felt was rightfully his. Nelson, and then we have a couple comments in the room.
So again, I have to apologize. My camera's not working. It worked during the week, so it's taking Shabbos off.
Nelson, we can't hear you. Are you speaking?
Yes, can't hear me either.
I think
Nothing's
something might
working?
be wrong with your connection because we don't see your video either.
Yeah,
So
I
I'll give you
know.
some time to try. Oh, was there a problem last week too? Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish we could hear your comment.
But I
Go
hear,
ahead and
I
we'll
do
work
hear
on it.
Nelson. I do hear him.
Mhm. Yeah. Good. So I'm going to repeat so everyone can hear. And also, Peter, I saw that you had unmuted and I couldn't hear you either. So now I'm suspecting maybe it's everyone on Zoom. I wonder if it's volume on our end. Not sure if there's anybody who's able or willing to help with tech on our side of things, in case that's the situation. But okay, so Ivan is saying it's a direct attack at Moses, but who is Moses and who is Aaron, right? He says as much. Moses says, who is Aaron that you should come at him? And remember that Moses didn't seek this leadership role, right? In fact, he said, send somebody else. Who am I, right? Mi anochi, who am I? Meanwhile, Korach is doing the very opposite. He's saying, do you know who I am? Right? It's the exact opposite mentality. And Judaism time and again says that those who should be leaders are the ones who are humble enough not to crave it and believe that they're entitled to it. But the other thing, what Ivan's saying is that this was God chose Moses and Aaron, right? It wasn't, they didn't even want this, right? God chose them. So when you're attacking Moses and Aaron, you're not attacking Moses and Aaron, you're attacking God, right? And then I think we can better understand why the punishment is so severe. What is the punishment?
He's swallowed up by the earth and fire.
He's swallowed up with the earth and fire, right? It's twofold. Datan, and Aviram, they actually get, and their company and their families get swallowed up. The earth opens up its mouth and swallows them. But the other followers, there are 250 people who are following their followers, they get struck with fire. They get consumed in fire. So both get consumed, but in different ways. Right. 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 Good. So let's step this out a second too. So the question then is not what he said, but how he said it, or what his motivations were when he said it, right? So what is, he might bring a legitimate argument, right? You take on too much upon yourself, right? Yitro said the same thing, but he did it in a way not of mutiny, right? This is where the rabbis get the L'Shem Shamayim, right? That how do you have an argument that is for heaven's sake versus for your own sake, right? I think Rabbi Hal's going to talk about this more. Hey, Ed, good to see you. Shabbat shalom. That Hillel and Shammai, they would always disagree. These great titans of our sages who would always debate. Their schools, their houses would always debate, but their children married each other, right? There was a respect and a love for each other. that transcend. So their arguments were not self-serving arguments the way Korach's is to say, I actually just want elevation, but I'm framing it as a legitimate grievance, but really he's just after it for himself. And that's not obviously an argument for heaven's sake, which is what is an argument for heaven's sake? To really understand Torah, to understand God's will, to create a better world, right? That's versus to just boost your own status. Wait, there was one more thing I wanted to say about this. But going back to the punishment, the earth opens, literally the foundations are shaken, more than just shaken. They're totally uprooted, right? So that speaks to the nature of the crime, that Korach, in attacking God, is actually striking at the very foundations upon which Judaism is being built, right? So in some ways, if it's a proportional response, what Korach is doing in challenging Moses's and Aaron's authority is actually shaking the whole foundations upon which this new nation is being built. Okay, let's go around. We'll work our way around. Go ahead, Bill.
So three things, some maybe require response.
Yeah.
So, one, this question of holiness, and if holiness is the end point of the journey, then we might as well all take our talit, hang them up and get out of here. I would think that holiness is that process.
Mhm.
And if it's not, again, none of us are going to reach whatever. We're never going to be God,
Mhm.
right? Even though that's what we're trying to attain. So I would argue to some degree, accepting the covenant with God was a major click up in holiness for the people. And there's other ways to go, but that was a big deal.
Mhm.
Second, no need to comment, the God of love that we heard last week from Rabbi Artson, I don't see necessarily well reflected this week. So it's a good choice to bring him in last week. Third, and this is a little story, not too much. Rabbi Foster was doing this one Shabbat, and I forget what the topic. Oh, it's about keeping mitzvot, and not everybody was keeping individually. And I asked him, how, as a conservative rabbi in a synagogue, how do you handle the fact that not all of your members are, as holy or as keeping as many mitzvot? And his comment has stuck well with me, and I don't know if it resonates with anyone else. And his comment was that as the community, he feels that we're a holy community. Because you do this, you do that, you do this, and all together, we're, in fact, if we let go of each other, then each individual fails, but all together as a community, we were reaching a very high level of holiness in our observance, in our thinking, whatever it might be. So I see that I like seeing that reflected here.
Yeah.
Because it was a nice idea. I mean, hold on.
Okay, I want to respond to a couple things here. So,
Robert Artson?
yeah, I'll start there. Sorry. So the God of love,
Side point.
is that a God who opens the earth and swallows and then sends down fire to consume? And remember, even in the room, Shira pushed back and said, wait a minute, if you look at Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, who, by the way, meet a very similar end, not the pit opening up, the earth opening, but the being consumed by fire, which came directly after having offered incense that was strange fire, Eish Sarah, right? And that's basically what happens here, right? Because Moses challenges them, invites them really to a ritual demonstration saying, okay, let's see whose offering God accepts, right? Elijah does this with the prophets of Baal later too. But so he says, bring your fire pans, offer incense, and I will do that too. And we'll see who God accepts, right? So this being consumed in the fire seems like a direct parallel to Nadav and Avihu, who also offered incense at a time when it was not decreed by God, right? Not at a set time. And that's the end that they meet as well. But so she was saying that doesn't sound like a very loving God, right? The God of recalibrating, right? Rabbi Arson uses that GPS metaphor of, God doesn't, bludgeon you for doing wrong, but recalibrates to get you to where you need to go, right? It's the lure. It's that invitation to make the right choices to be your best self. But his response to Shira, and I'm paraphrasing, was essentially, it depends how literally you read it, right? And this isn't just him being a radical. Actually, Philo, going back to ancient Greece, had a very rationalist understanding of Torah. and said that often the Torah employs language of metaphor, and it's not always necessarily historically accurate. Again, this is very spicy. You could agree with it, you could disagree with it. That's fine. I'm not saying that this is where I'm at necessarily, but it's important to know that it's actually a very valid stream of Jewish thought that goes back a long time. And Philo says that. So, for instance, what could be the metaphor here? Here's what I might offer. For instance, Philo says that Abraham and Sarah represent wisdom. So a lot of their stories are about sort of wisdom in the context of idolatry and what does true wisdom mean. So you can understand things metaphorically is sort of what Philo and what Rabbi Artzin's saying. So I don't think Rabbi Artzin believes that God literally consume Nadav and Avihu in fire. I think that really that is our sacred text teaching us about the importance of boundaries, perhaps. Were they drunk when they did it? What does it mean to serve God? What does it mean to deviate from God's commandments, right? Even if it's to add on to them, but the Torah says don't add, don't take away. But in this case, maybe it's telling a story about, and this is where I maintain the God of love thing, about the dangers of ego unchecked, that it is literally an endless pit. There is no, if you approach life with a mentality of, what about me? That is forever. That is an endless, bottomless pit that consumes you and your family and everyone around you, right? But instead, if you approach life as community, what about us? The sanctity of this community, and this is what I'm going to get into with the Ufruf couple. So I apologize for dipping into that. You'll get a sneak preview of that. But what does it mean to approach life not from the place of ego? What about me? But to look at life in terms of the other and community, right? And yourself as being an important, irreplaceable part of that fabric. But so I just want to say one more thing, going back actually to what Ivan said. If Korach was all about equality, this is a comment that one of the rabbis makes in the Hasidic commentary, which I brought with me, Iturei Torah. You know, if anybody wants for reference, I can always pass around. It's great. It means Torah gems. But this rabbi says, if he was so much about equality, he would have rejected being made a Levite. Where was he when God made them Levites if he's all about we're all holy and we should all be equal, right? So his argument, actually, there's a bit of hypocrisy there. So that's sort of one of the clues that really he's in it for himself and his motivations are not pure. Okay, more David, and then we have this side of the room. Yeah.
Respect, and I appreciate your point of view, but I'm going to disagree with it.
Great.
I think that this was keeping in mind that the Torah is not always quote in order, but let's just say this for the sake of argument here. We had the spies. That was a disaster. We sent them out. We had the attempt to go into the land anyway.
Yeah.
That was an even bigger disaster, or arguably the same disaster. And now we have Korah coming after all of that. If you want to find a God of love in this, I would suggest you could find it in what happened, whether it happened or not, we don't even have to argue about. God saved the people from themselves in a sense. Nobody wants the earth to open up and swallow them up, but there are times that are cutting edge, if you will, of a disaster or moving on to a better life. And this certainly seems to have been one of them. Particularly when you consider what happened before.
That's the danger of the theology, right? So it's a very nice, and I'm not dismissing it outright, but it could be slippery.
Difference. And this is, I think I appreciate what you're saying, Bill, is it's not up to me to decide what God thinks. That's up to God to decide. So it's very dangerous to say, well, we have this example, so let's go ahead and be Khomeini and slaughter a bunch of people who are opposed to him. Or make a speech about what a great victory his defeat was, or anything else that sort of person does. I'm not arguing for that at all. What I'm pointing out is that if we want to find a God of love in this, even if you feel that tough love is some kind of a stretch, if God doesn't do what God did, I don't think Moses is going to be able to do it.
Right. So you could read just even in a literal read that there is still a God of love at work here, right? Who in some case might be protecting the people against itself. I think that's a very interesting point.
Because I'm troubled by everybody's attempts to apologize for God. This is in our text, whether you like it or not. So rather than trying to find an apologetic, let's try to find how do we find a positive in what is an otherwise pretty freaky story of violence and negativity, other than the negativity comes from the very rebellion itself. And I'm just suggesting that if God doesn't intervene in some way, we're probably not sitting here talking now.
Yeah. So first of all, kol hakavod for taking God's side, and I want to say that I'm not on that side, right? I'm not on that side. Yeah. Right. But apologetics goes both ways, right? One is finding the justification for why it's actually a good thing, but also, actually with Rabbi Artson on our on my interview for rabbinical school, you have your interview, and I was saying I don't think it's appropriate to get angry at God. This was me at the beginning of my rabbinic journey. I said, because God has a reason. We don't know. Like, I think it's sort of hubris, going back to ego, right? To be angry at God instead of, recognizing that maybe there's our own limitations that we just can't comprehend. And Rabbi Artson kind of pushed back and said, what is this view of God that you have where God isn't big enough to handle your rage? Right? What does that say about your relationship and your conception of God that you think that you can't get angry at God? And that changed the way that I look at it. By the way, there's also a great colleague of mine, Rabbi Maya Zinkow, who taught a great session on rage, where she was saying that anger, and by the way, the Hasidim hate anger. So I'm going to close the book so that I don't offend their ears. Yeah, that's true. They would. Plus, it doesn't matter what I say. They can't get angry at me, so it actually works. So she was saying that anger is relational, right? As opposed to other emotions like obviously apathy or shame. These are sort of inward, tail between your legs emotions. But anger is directed at, and in that way, it's relational, right? Not always. I'm not here. Yeah. So we could go ahead. Do you want to respond?
Oh, there can be terrible things that happen to a person that are not relational that make you angry. So
100%. Thank you. I don't mean 100%, and I appreciate the qualification. And anger can just be toxic and horrible and abusive. But I think when talking about anger at God, you can dissect it a little bit and say anger means that there is still somebody wanting to be in relationship, and as opposed to walking away or closing the door on a relationship with God, right? Saying, and this is sort of what, right? God says in God's anger this week, stand aside that I may wipe out this congregation in an instant. And Moses pushes back. Well, first he falls on his face. He falls on his face 3 times, I think, this part. But he says that you wouldn't do this, right? You wouldn't wipe away the whole congregation, just the offenders. Right? This sounds a lot like Abraham saying, shall not the judge of all the earth judge justly? Would you wipe away the wicked with the good? Right? So there is this sort of pushback and this staying in relationship with God and saying, hey, you wouldn't do this. And maybe there's some anger there saying you wouldn't, this is far be it from you to do that. And I have to think that God actually wants that from God's prophets, right? What good are my prophets if they don't stand up for humanity? Right? Wait, sorry, I want to go. There are some first time comments and then I'll get back to you. So let's go around this way. Go ahead, Larry.
Important message first.
Yeah.
They go directly to the community, which on one hand, you could say they're all a community, but really, if they have something strong message. Why not bring it to the leader first before you rile up the people?
Didn't
Great.
he do that? Didn't he go straight to Moses?
No.
Let's examine, let's examine.
Paying at 250 before he came to.
That's my instinct too, but let's look at it. So, but just to repeat back in case you couldn't hear, and Nelson, I see your hand. I'm hoping that the tech works. I'm not sure that we can hear. We haven't been able to hear Zoom this morning. But what Larry is saying is that once again, it's not necessarily what he's saying, but how he's saying it, right? If you actually wanted to make change, do you go over the head of the leadership straight to the people? Maybe there are times that call for that, but certainly first you should try to go straight to the leadership and say, hey, this is my complaint. Let's address this and at least give them a chance, right? The daughters of Slavcha do that, right? They go to Moses and they say, hey, something's not just here. And Moses says, I hear your concern. I actually need to ask God about this one. And God answers, they're right. That seems like a much better model, right?
Even do some. You check with Moses about what they're thinking they're going to do.
Right.
They just.
Wait, so let's go back and let's see if they go straight to Moses first or not. So now, by the way, also it says Vaikach Korach ben Yitzhar, right? He took. It doesn't make sense. Now Korach, son of Yitzhar, took himself, right? It's not really clear what it means to take yourself. Okay. Yeah, so they came armed in a sense, right? They didn't come with a peaceful conversation first. And that again goes for argument for heaven's sake or argument for your own sake. So what does it mean that Korach took? It's weird language. It doesn't say that he appeared before or that he went before. It says that he took himself. So Rashi, actually it says he took. Rashi explains he took himself. Lakach. Vayikach Korach. Yeah, he took. And the question is, what is he taking, right? So Rashi says that he took himself. And Rabbi Simcha Bunam of Peshishka, he's the father of, actually, I think the second in the Musar movement, which is the Jewish movement that focuses on cultivating inner traits. So he says, Korach was blessed with many positive attributes. He came from a fine lineage. He was a wise man. He was wealthy. Indeed, he might have been worthy of being a leader of the Jewish people. Why then was he not given such a position? It is because Vayikach Korach. Now, took Korach, he took himself. He did not wait until he was offered the leadership, but sought to take it by force. That was why he was not worthy of it. So I think we can grapple with this a little bit because on one hand, self-advocacy is important. If the daughters of Slavchad hadn't stood up for what they believed was rightfully theirs, right, for their sense of an injustice that they were experiencing, they never would have gotten what they did. And I think God actually wants that of us. Just like I think God wants Moses to say, hey, you wouldn't wipe away everyone, right, the whole congregation, just those who offended, right? So similarly, I think God actually wants our active participation in Torah and understanding God's will. And that's the whole written Torah versus the oral law, right? Why do we have Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash? Well, because we believe as Jews that God actually gives us the raw ingredients, but wants our partnership in really wrestling with and understanding what God wants and adding our voices to that tradition.
Second verse there, it says Vayakumu. Does it say anything about, I mean, the English says they rose up, but Vayakumu doesn't mean they rose up. It means they got up.
Yes.
So
Okay.
What does the book say about that? It's a continuation of the.
Yeah, I don't think there was any. I don't think there was commentary on that there, but grammatically, yeah, we're going to keep going around the room. Grammatically, though,
Went to that point.
yeah, but grammatically, I think it's about emphasis. If it's the PL form, and I'd have to take a second to decode it, but if it's the PL form, that's emphasis. So it could be saying like, even though yakum, takum, right, it means to lakum is to rise, but in a certain grammatical structure, if it's PL, it's intensive. So it could be connoting rising up, which is more aggressive. Okay, wait, let's keep going.
Here in Barry, I think.
First time comments, Barry, yeah.
Just maybe showing my ignorance, do we know that Korach really knows that God appointed Moses and Aaron? You know that?
Well, so it's a good question. I would say at this stage, I mean, they've been there from the beginning, right? They've in Egypt when Moses and Aaron were the ones who would go to Pharaoh, that they were performing the miracles, the plagues. I think everybody knows, and at this point, also the Kohanim have been empowered with the priestly duties. So I think he is very aware. But clearly, there still needed to be a demonstration, because at the end of the Torah portion this week, what happens? The leaders of the tribes bring their staffs, and Aaron brings his staff, and Aaron's blooms almonds, right? So it clearly, Barry's right. It seems like the people needed a definitive, hey, who's in charge here? Right? Or who is God choosing, right? We had two demonstrations of God saying, hey, I choose them, right? One is much more dramatic, one is much more beautiful, right? The almonds budding from the rod. But yes, I think that I would judge them as being knowledgeable, that they are well aware of what they're doing when they are speaking out against the leadership. Any other comments on the side of the room?
Nelson.
Yeah, is anybody on Zoom able to speak? I don't know if the audio is working.
Can you hear me?
Yes, okay, go ahead. No, now you're muted, but it does work. Unmute yourself and we can hear you.
All right. So I was just going to comment. It's an older comment, but maybe it's still relevant. What kind of an honor do Levites get? They're schlepping. Moses was out walking in front, and they're schlepping the Mishkan. That's not an honor. That's just labor.
Okay, great question. Here's what I would say. It is schlepping. Although, ask our synagogue, it's a great honor to hold the Torah and to process around the room, and right. So to come into direct contact with the sacred objects. Remember, King David gets very upset because they're transferring the Torah and the ark to Jerusalem, but the cattle stumble, the ark, and somebody reaches out his hand to steady the ark, and he is smitten for it. He dies. Because again, it's sort of like that Nadav and Avihu, like to what extent are you crossing a boundary that you are not to cross, right? God is entering into a relationship with us, but it doesn't mean that we can, right? When God gives Torah, set a boundary around the mountain that the people are not to cross. Don't even have the cattle graze at the base of the mountain, right? There are sacred boundaries in this relationship with God, and we can't be so presumptuous as to cross them. Although again, there are wonderful examples of when Moses seems to not be so bashful about crossing boundaries with God. Abraham, right? Our great heroes do this. But regardless, so there is clearly great sanctity and even great power and awe and fear associated with that. So it is an honor to be set apart for that, even if it's a bit more of grunt work, you could say. But the other thing is they would also sing, right? They would sing a song of ascents, right? Ascending the temple stairs, right, up to the temple. Yeah, Shir Hamalot, right? A song of ascents. The Levites were also singing, and there's actually a beautiful commentary about this is something I talked to our board about recently, which is that as leaders of a Jewish community, bearing the sacred objects of a temple, as we do, it can often feel like grunt work. It can feel like a burden. It can be very difficult at times. And it might just devolve into merely a sense of obligation. Why do I do this, all this service? Well, because it's obligation, and it's fulfilling, and it's beautiful work, but it's an obligation. And I'm saying it's actually not enough to just lead from that place, because the Levites, when they would bear the weight of those sacred objects, they would also sing, right? Service to the Jewish people should also be joyful. And we can't forget that, right? And we have to tap back into what is it about Judaism and Jewish community that we find that have always given us that sense of joy, right? Maybe it was summer camp as a kid. Maybe it was like transport yourself back to a moment where you felt, maybe it was a simcha, a wedding, right? Or maybe it was, something where you felt truly joyful. And that also is wrapped up in what it means to bear the weight of the object. So I do think it's an honor, and I don't think it wasn't just schlepping. The Levites were set apart for a great service in the temple. But it's a good point. I can see why you would think that.
They also received the tithes.
They got tithes. They didn't get an inheritance, though, right? They didn't get a land, but everybody had to make place in their territories for people. Sheila, we haven't heard from you yet. Go ahead.
one circumstances, they don't feel that they can be the top guy, but they want to work with him. They want to be on his committee. They want to be in his presence. There are people like that. And we must thank them. I mean, all our ushers and things like that. Synagogue doesn't work without them.
Actually, 100%, yeah.
Most
Yeah, so I love that. Well, one of my favorite commentaries is about, it's also it's Musar, it's Simcha Bunim of Peshishka. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who is the father of Musar, and Simcha Zissel is his disciple. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is talking with a colleague, and he's praising his student, Simcha Zissel. He's saying, oh my gosh, he is such an amazing student. He is brilliant. He's all these great things. And the colleague pushes back and says, if he's so great, how come I've never heard of him? Right? Like I would have heard of him if he was such a man of renown as you say. And Rabbi Yisrael Salanter responds with a parable. He says, on Shabbos, if we have two challahs, right? And one is a big, impressive challah, but somebody already ripped into it. And we have a small challah, but it's intact. Which challah do we make hamotzi over? The small challah. And he said the small challah but the one that's intact gets the blessing because shleimut, wholeness, completion, fullness is more important than gadlut, greatness, whatever that means, right? So I think there's a lot of ways you can internalize that story as a helpful message. One can be sort of not burning yourself out, recognizing that if you're the big challah, everybody wants a piece of you. And again, what is that endless pit that takes you, your family, and everyone around you, right? Ambition is not a bad thing. Ambition is a good thing, but when it's unchecked, when it's only serving your ego, because you want greatness, if you don't want it for the right reasons, is destructive. But fullness, shleimut, right? We have a wellness center here because we think that that's valuable, that we should be people who feel a sense of inner wholeness, right? In a world that can tear us apart, right? So shleimut, wholeness. And as Sheila's saying, that might mean it's not just the history book figures that are worth something, right? But each and every one of us living a meaningful life, or the ones behind the scenes making everything work, right? They don't necessarily get the credit. How often do we really, thank and appreciate our ushers and right? Or the bureaucrats who have taken a lot of heat lately, right? But as Rabbi Hal said in his he spoke about the prayer for the government and that these are people who faithfully devote themselves to the needs of the public, right? But often there either is underappreciation or animosity heaped at that. And maybe there's valid concerns about bureaucracy, but again, not when you lose the humanity of it. Okay, some more comments. Larry, you had a part two, then Ivan, then David. Go ahead.
Rabbi Tversky, who's also a psychiatrist,
Mhm.
talked about that Torah, who was a very righteous person, as were his immediate group of followers. But he talked mainly about Torah, that in some cases, a person really believes what they're doing is right, is justified, but they're blinded through motive or jealousy because they can't see it, like a psychological mechanism. And because they don't discuss it with anyone, they don't have a spiritual advisor that they go through ahead of time. No one points out to them what's your true motive. No one questions them. They have gone to motives. So he takes from that we all need someone we go to for important decisions.
Hmm.
Because sometimes we can't really see our true motives. He takes this, harsh and interprets it that way. I like that.
Yeah, I love that. It's a very compassionate read, even of Korah, right? Who we can vilify and say is just a creature of pure ego. But then you look into the psychology of it. Did he have anybody that he could talk to? Did he think that he was doing the right thing and he was just blind to something and didn't have somebody to show a blind spot? Or maybe there was even, yeah, anyway, I think that's really interesting. Go ahead, Ivan.
He's not in the leader, having a breakdown. He actually said to God, don't accept their.
Mhm.
He's saying to God, don't, I mean, this is unacceptable.
Hmm.
And not only that, he doesn't, the whole group is swallowed up. It's hard to tell the difference between the Reubenites there.
We've gotten to that.
But in the end, what happens doesn't resolve the problem. People become even angry.
That's right.
Help them.
Yeah, so there are a couple things I want to point out. One is Moses kind of not forces God's hand here, but preempts what God's going to do. At least Moses tells God, right? If he says, and we can find it, but he says basically, okay, if you have it, chapter.
How the Lord paid no regard to their oblation.
Yeah, right. So let's do that. 863, starting verse 16. And Moses said to Korah, tomorrow you and all your company appear before the Lord, you and they and Aaron, each of you take his fire pans, lay incense, each of you bring his fire pan, right? And there's okay, they took the fire pan, I'm skipping ahead. Presence of the Lord appeared, stand back, I'm going to annihilate them, right? God is already going to do it, but they fell on their faces, hold on. Will you be wrathful with the whole community, right? So Moses is tempering God here. But when it comes to the opening the earth piece, that's coming from Moses. And then God follows, that could speak to the breakdown that you're talking about. So on one hand, he does spare the whole community. And this isn't the first time. Remember with the spies, God says, I'm going to start again with you. And there's a midrash where Moses says, if a chair with 3 legs can't stand, meaning if the people of Israel who come from 3 generations of our patriarchs and matriarchs, right? Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah, those 3 generations, those 3 legs. How can a chair stand with 1? How can you start again with me and it endure if the merit of our ancestors is not enough to sustain us, right? So he already spares the people once. He's sparing the people again now. If God is truly threatening to wipe them all out, I'm not actually sure that's the case. I read it as God wanting Moses to push back. But regardless, but then Moses does say, he actually dictates the term of the demonstration. He says, let the earth open, and then God sort of follows, which is interesting that he's able to sort of not force God's hand, but then there's commentary about that, well, he wouldn't have done that if they hadn't talked about it beforehand or but it's interesting. Yeah. 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 Yeah, that's right. We know that he's at a breaking point. Yeah. And by the way, he succumbs to it in the end, right? By hitting the rock twice. And again, the Hasidim who hate anger say that what he really did in that moment was idol worship, because God says, you shall not worship, but there shall not be a strange God within you, Elzar b'tocham, within you. And so they interpret that to mean, what is the strange God within you? That's anger within us, the emotion within us that overcomes that that we worship when we serve, right? So they're saying that in the end, Moses gave into his anger, and that was essentially idolatry, which is obviously antithetical to the whole.
Oh, a person that's a leader, that separate, your role from what you see a person.
So I actually want to jump off on this for 1 second, and then there were some more hands, but you know what the big irony in all this is? They kind of get what they wanted, just not the way they wanted it. Did you know Edgar Allan Poe's The Monkey Paw? You get your wishes come true, but always not the way you wanted it. Like, be careful what you wish for is basically what so it's like a Twilight Zone. Yeah. Right. So what happens is they say we're all Kedoshim. We want the sacred role in the sanctuary that the Kohanim have, right? Moses says, would you seek the Kohanut too? Would you take the priestship as well? Guess what happens with the fire pans that they used in this demonstration? What happens to the copper and the pans that they used for the test?
You get nailed to the outside of the altar.
Except
Except it's not nailed.
Yeah, it's overlaid in the altar, that it's used in the altar. So, hey, you did it. And that is Kedoshim. You're right. We're all holy. Now, you wanted your sacred role. You are actually going to be the altar, right? There's no, and it's going to be a sign and a reminder for the people forever. So they got, in a sense, what they wanted, but obviously they didn't.
Well, maybe that was just a reminder to everybody, don't.
I think it's a deterrent. But I think it's also an interesting thing about what does it mean to be sacred? And yes, we're all sacred, but is that, do you pursue an ego-driven life of what about me? What about me? Or are you a Kli Kodesh? Are you a sacred vessel for God, right? Their instruments, ultimately, you would think you would have to desecrate those because they were used by this mutiny. Right, that they would be the opposite of sacred objects, right? They're an abomination. But no, they're sacred because, first of all, that they were following what Moses said. Moses said, do this. So on one hand, they were listening to Moses, but on the other, they were used as sacred vessels. So I think getting to what you're saying, Ivan, about what it says about leadership. Do you see yourself as what's in it for me, and how do I rise, and how do I get the honor I believe I deserve? Or is it, I am a Kli Kodesh. I am a sacred object through which the divine flows. And it's not about me, although you bring yourself into your work, there's no question, and that's an important ingredient. But it's the humility of seeing yourself as a sacred vessel through which God flows, right? That is what any good leader should, I believe, be, right? They're actually, I think I was telling you this before, but there's another great midrash where there's a Roman who is making fun of a rabbi who he calls ugly. He's very mature, but he says, woe to such great wisdom that is housed in such an ugly vessel. And this is actually the daughter of the emperor who says this. And the rabbi responds to the daughter, your father, his wine, I bet it's stored in really beautiful vessels. And she goes, no, they're stored in oak barrels. And he says, what? The royal wine? You should store that in something that befits the honor of the emperor. And she goes, you're absolutely right. And so she puts it into golden or silver vessels. And what happens? The wine spoils because the container seeps in to that which it contains. So this is something that Rabbi Ilana Kirshen talks about how when you study Torah, we are vessels for the divine, but also there is a chemical reaction that takes place between us and the text, so that it's always unique because it carries the unique ingredient of you, right? That's only you. So I'm not saying that leaders should just be empty vessels, right? The vessels interact, you bring yourself to your work, and that's very important. But again, it's what's your motivation and how do you see yourself? Is it, I am so great, I deserve it, it's all about me? Or am I a vessel for the community, for Torah, for God to flow? I wanted to return to one more point before I forget, which is the loving God thing. So the earth opening up and swallowing them, it's Sheol, right? And this brings up all kinds of questions about the afterlife, and do Jews believe in hell? Because this really kind of seems like a Jewish conception of hell, right? The earth swallowed, there's fire. What's going on here? But the rabbis sort of understand this as a purgatory state, right? Where there is sort of maybe punishment, or there is a cleansing of souls that goes on here for transgressions. However, there's a verse from prophets that says, but God, you raise people from death. This is something that Elliot, I know is important to you. You talk about Tchiat HaMetim, right? But that God, you raise people from the dead, but from the pit, even from Sheol. So going back to angry God, loving God, you could read this literally and say, that does seem like an angry God. And I don't buy your whole read it as metaphor thing. I really do. I'm reading this literally, and that's an angry God. However, it's not the end of the story, right? We also have Torah that says, but God, you raise people ultimately, even from the depths of Sheol. You do not abandon them forever. And I think that's love. But the other piece is, who are the sons of Korach, Bnei Korach? It seems like all the families get consumed or go to the pit. But what about Korach's sons? What do we know about them? They compose psalms, right? So the earth is opening its mouth here to swallow them. And also that should immediately take us to what other early story in Torah where the earth opens its mouth? When Cain kills Abel, again, out of jealousy, which kind of feels like a parallel to Korach, saying, hey, you chose Abel's offering. What about me? What about me? To the point where that leads to the first fratricide, the first murder. And the earth opens its mouth to swallow the blood of Abel. And the earth is punished for this because it's seen as being complicit in a crime, a cover-up. Literally, it's a cover-up job. Right? It swallows Abel's blood, and so we have to labor to bring forth food from the ground. But the earth is cursed because of its role, and so in a way, the earth opening its mouth here is redemption for the land, which in the first case covered up a crime, and in this case is punishing those who were truly guilty of a crime, whereas Abel wasn't guilty of anything at all. Right? So, yeah, and Sodom, say more. Sorry to do that into the microphone. Yeah. Yes, right. The land is desecrated. That's why the Canaanites are expelled from the land. It's not because you're so great. Don't feed the ego. Don't get. It's because the inhabitants have corrupted the land. They've done things that they sacrifice their children to Molech. Right? They've desecrated the land.
I wasn't able to be here last week. We were out of town, but I think that love is one of the attributes of God. But there is a lot of justice and strength and revenge and many other attributes. On the other hand, I think that Jesus was a God of love.
Yeah.
And when people in Christianity, they talk about God loves you, it was a new idea because it used the power of love is so immense, and it channeled that religion. And I believe in Judaism, it's only part of God's attribute.
I love that. Right. So two things I want to say. Two things. 2 books. I know. Thank you. So 2 books. Shai Held wrote a book called Judaism is About Love. We're trying to get him to come as a scholar in residence. I think he has a 2-year wait period. So it's going to be, but he wrote a book called Judaism About Love. Yeah.
You've gotten the point.
Okay, cool. Okay. But the other thing is, Marilyn Robbins and I've talked about this a lot, but I haven't talked about it in a while, so I'm bringing it back. Reading Genesis. She's a devout Christian, and she says, hey, there is this idea that the Old Testament God is a God of anger and fury, and the New Testament God is a God of love. But I'm doing a close read of Genesis, and I actually think this Hebrew God is a God of love too. But point well taken that
As a Christian, I would want that to be the case.
that's true. Maybe it's I know, I feel like you've
Yeah,
pushed back on her a couple times, but But it's compelling. If you read her book, it's really compelling. And but your point is that you're not saying God isn't a God of love. You're saying God is not only a God of love. And I think one of Judaism's great geniuses is that we focus more on mitzvot than we do about love. Although Rabbi Artson says this thing about mitzvot being connections, and that there actually are in that way an expression of love, right? For community, for God, that these are things that connect you to. Yeah, right. It's an affirmation of love. It comes right after Ahava Rabbah. How great is your love, right? So reciprocal love. So it does run through, but it's not the extent to which, and that's sort of the Fiddler on the Roof. Do you love me? What are you talking about? For 25, right? It does. Love is irrelevant. It's what I do. If that's not love, what is? Right. So we are very behavior and action oriented, and I think that's
in the Middle Ages. People were burned at the stake for not believing.
Right.
It's about belief.
right.
But in Judaism, it's about what you do.
Yeah.
So action and.
I will.
Exactly. Wait, hold on. Let's get Bill because he was raising his hand.
Out of love, we just came back from Spain. We
I
visited
did.
Plaza Mayor in Madrid, where they still have panels running all around the plaza celebrating auto de fe, which means acts of faith. So what they did was they took new Christians, whether they thought they were still Jewish in their hearts or not, or whatever, and burned them alive at the stake in front of an audience who cheered. Why? Because that was an act of faith. They're going to God.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Bill,
Kind of love.
and then I want to say one final word about the sons of Korah. So don't let me forget. One final word about the sons of Korah.
So to do this, you're hearing so much interest in what Rabbi said, thinking through it. Perhaps in the moment it was hard to discuss with him, but perhaps you, Rabbi Alex, without being feeling like you're in the spot, maybe we could have a session breaking down some of those.
Yeah,
ideas.
we've talked about it as a clergy team already. I think we can do that, whether it's like the beginning of our lunch and learn when we revamp it, or beforehand if we want to do some kind of like debrief. Yeah, people forget about it. But yeah, happy to do that. But the last thing I want to say is, and I think I am going to repeat this at the FRF, so I apologize. But the earth opens its mouth to swallow. And again, that's a sort of redemption for the earth, which had sinned with cover up of Abel's blood. Korach opens his mouth to say, what about me? What about me? What about me? But there's redemption for him too. Just like the land gets redeemed, I think Korach gets redeemed through his sons who opened their mouths for prayer, for praise of God. They wrote Psalms. Most of them are attributed to King David, although one is attributed to Moses, and we read that. They've already read it, but we read it in the morning service. But there are others that are attributed to the sons of Korah, which again goes to like God not punishing the sins for the.
I got to answer.
Punishing the children for the sins of the parents, right? That we are each judged on our own, and that we're not doomed by what came before us, right? We're not destined to stay sort of chained to our past, but that they open their mouths in prayer. So I think ambition is a good thing. It's not inherently bad, right? But there is a midrash where they get rid of the evil inclination and the world falls apart because the chickens won't lay eggs. There's no competitive drive that people are motivated to work or for that sake to procreate, right? There's no sort of evil inclination being channeled for sacred purposes. There's no drive in that way. And so the world actually falls apart. So ambition is a good thing, but it can't be in service of the ego. It has to be in service of the community. And when we open our mouths, when is it for our own self-aggrandizement? When is it like the daughters of Slofchad to actually mitigate an injustice and do it in a way that's l'shem shamayim, for heaven's sake, right? Not for mutiny, but within a framework that is respectful dialogue.
They're only molecules apart. They're not that far apart, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And finally, when do we open our mouths? How is opening our mouths for the sake of praising God and making our life a blessing for our community, for the world? So that's my charge to us all, that we open our mouths in prayer and channel that ambition, not for mutiny, but for creating a more just and peaceful world. So Shabbat Shalom on a global scale and in our own lives.
Or